You can support me by turning on notifications, subscribing to my channel, and liking the video. Waiting for your comments. Zodiac Killer. The mystery that was never solved in the annals of American true crime. Few figures evoke the same enduring sense of dread and fascination as the self-proclaimed Zodiac Killer, a man who terrorized Northern California in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Even his chosen moniker, Zodiac, feels charged with dark symbolism, hinting at stars, constellations, and destinies determined by cryptic forces beyond ordinary understanding. To this day, more than half a century later, the Zodiac stands as one of the most haunting unsolved cases in criminal history, a puzzle that has resisted every effort at closure. From the earliest grisly murders on secluded lovers' lanes to the haunting letters peppered with coded messages, threats, and taunting bravado, the Zodiac wove a narrative of fear that gripped the nation. In a world where few crimes remain permanently unanswered, his story is a stark reminder that some mysteries endure, that evil can sometimes vanish into obscurity without being named, and that the human drive to solve what appears unsolvable is both relentless and incomplete. Although the popular imagination often associates the period of the late 1960s with peace movements, the summer of love, the blossoming of countercultural ideals, and the sprawling tapestry of revolutionary music and social change, there was also a sharp rise in violent crime, serial murders, and random assaults. Yet even in an era that produced the Manson family and a string of headline-grabbing killers, the Zodiac stood apart for his persistence, his mocking relationship with the press, and most chillingly, his refusal to present an obvious pattern or motive. He seemed to kill for the sake of killing, for the thrill of attention, or for a cryptic and unsettling philosophy he occasionally hinted at in his letters. Something about collecting slaves for the afterlife, about hunting humans as though it were sport, and about reveling in the terror he caused. From the rural roads around Vallejo and Benicia to the shores of Lake Berryessa, from the city streets of San Francisco to the pages of cryptic code mailed to local newspapers, the Zodiac's presence became an inescapable source of fear for the citizens of Northern California. Even people on the other side of the country soon learned his name, thanks to his own efforts at self-promotion. He wrote letters to editors, demanded that his coded messages be published on front pages, and threatened to kill more victims if his demands were not met. Perhaps the most unnerving thing about the Zodiac story, though, is that he was never caught. Despite massive investigations by local law enforcement, the coordination of multiple county sheriff's departments, and even the involvement of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, no one was definitively identified or brought to trial. The chilling specter of the Zodiac remains an open wound in criminal history, a ghost who once brandished guns and knives and then disappeared, leaving behind incomplete ciphers, intriguing suspects, and endless speculation. The crimes most reliably attributed to the Zodiac started on December 20th, 1968, with the murders of two teenagers, Betty Lou Jensen and David Arthur Faraday, on Lake Herman Road near Benicia, California. In the crisp winter air, the couple had driven out to a secluded lovers' lane area, as young people often did, seeking privacy in the hush of rural darkness. Sometime around 11 p.m., an unknown individual arrived at the site. David and Betty Lou were found shot near their car, both with fatal gunshot wounds. Betty Lou was evidently shot multiple times in the back as she attempted to flee, while David died close to the vehicle. There was no sign of robbery or sexual assault, only a seeming execution. At the time, no one realized that a serial killer was beginning his bloody enterprise. Initially, the double murder was a grim local tragedy, but it did not immediately ring the alarm bells that a single perpetrator intended to keep killing. Yet this crime would later be recognized as the Zodiac's first definitive strike, especially once he began making phone calls and writing letters claiming responsibility for those kids on Lake Herman Road. The second confirmed Zodiac attack on July 4th, 1969, brought the case into sharper focus. Another young couple, Darlene Farron and Mike Mageau, were in a car at the Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo when a strange vehicle pulled up. The driver left, then returned a few minutes later. Approaching the couple's car with a blinding flashlight, he opened fire, killing Darlene Farron and gravely wounding Mike Mageau. Though Mageau survived, he was left traumatized. Less than an hour later, a male caller phoned the Vallejo Police Department, not only admitting responsibility for the Blue Rock Springs shooting, but also claiming he was the same man who killed the couple at Lake Herman Road. That phone call, delivered in a calm, chilling voice, was the first of many brazen communications in which the Zodiac claimed credit for these crimes. From that point on, local authorities strongly suspected that this was a singular menace prowling the region. Then came a watershed moment on August 1st, 1969, when 3 separate letters arrived at 3 different newspapers: the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner. These letters each contained a piece of a coded message, what would collectively be called the 408 cipher, and demanded publication. The writer threatened more killings if his cryptic puzzle was not printed on the front pages. He then ended with an unnerving sign-off: "This is the Zodiac speaking." Thus, the name by which he would be known, the Zodiac Killer, found its way into the headlines, and soon the entire Bay Area was abuzz with speculation, panic, and the tantalizing possibility that if someone could solve the code, the killer's identity might be revealed. A local teacher named Donald Harden and his wife, Betty, managed to crack the cipher, which revealed a message about how the killer took delight in murder because it was so much fun. Yet it pointedly ended by saying he would not reveal his name for fear that the killings might be stopped. This twisted logic showed that the Zodiac was not just murdering people. He was playing a game of cat and mouse with the public, seeking attention and feeding off the fear he caused. The next brutal strike that could be confidently tied to the Zodiac took place on September 27, 1969, at Lake Berryessa. It was different from the previous shootings in that it happened in broad daylight and involved a more elaborate staging. A young college couple, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, were relaxing on the lake shore when a man wearing a black hooded costume emblazoned with a peculiar cross-circle symbol confronted them. Brandishing a gun, he directed Cecilia to tie Brian's wrists with pre-cut pieces of clothesline, and then demanded that Brian do the same to her. Once they were immobilized, he pulled out a knife and viciously stabbed them, leaving them for dead. Before departing, he scrawled a message on Hartnell's car door, listing the previous Zodiac attacks and marking the date and time, almost as though bragging. Cecilia Shepard, severely wounded, died in the hospital 2 days later. Brian Hartnell survived to describe his attacker, recalling that the man seemed both controlled and strangely ritualistic, as if he had planned every detail. Shortly after, a call was placed to the Napa County Sheriff's Office from a payphone in nearby Napa, once again claiming responsibility. The Zodiac had left his signature at the scene. It was as though he was building a personal myth of unstoppable violence, each act more theatrical than the last. The final confirmed killing came on October 11, 1969, in the Presidio Heights district of San Francisco. Paul Stein, a 29-year-old taxi driver, was shot once in the head by a passenger who'd requested a ride to that upscale neighborhood. The killer took a piece of Stein's bloodied shirt as a trophy, fled the scene, and later mailed a piece of that fabric to the Chronicle to prove his responsibility. This act, coupled with a chilling threat to shoot children as they exited a school bus, catapulted the Zodiac's notoriety to new extremes. The authorities were left scrambling. By now, the nation was aware that a cunning, elusive, and brazen murderer was on the loose, someone who had shown no hesitation in switching methods or geographical areas. Witnesses saw a man casually walking away from the taxi, rummaging through it before disappearing into the night. Despite immediate police presence in the vicinity, a mix-up in suspect descriptions allowed the killer to slip away in what might have been the closest chance to apprehend him. From that point forward, the Zodiac's written communications escalated, intensifying his hold over the public psyche. He continued mailing letters, threatening mass violence and ridiculing law enforcement's failures. People pored over every word, every reference. He sometimes peppered his letters with lines from popular musicals like The Mikado, adding an offbeat theatrical dimension to his already unsettling persona. He addressed individual police officers by name, toyed with the media, and claimed at times to have murdered far more individuals than the official tally indicated. In one letter, he insisted he had 37 victims. Although law enforcement was unable to verify most of these claims, the mere possibility that he was behind other unconnected homicides stoked the flames of public fear. Amid this swirl of terror, a few key individuals emerged at the center of the investigation. Among them was Detective Dave Tashi of the San Francisco Police Department, who became somewhat of a public face for the case. Known for his bold style and dogged persistence, Tashi chased down leads and suspects relentlessly. The pressure on him was monumental. The Zodiac specifically called him out in letters, mocking the police's inability to halt the killings. Despite Tashi's dedication and that of many other investigators across multiple jurisdictions, Vallejo, Benicia, Napa, San Francisco, and even the FBI, no definitive arrest took place. The multi-county nature of the Zodiac's crimes complicated the case significantly, as each sheriff's office had its own procedures, and information sharing was less streamlined than one might expect today. Although various ballistic tests, fingerprint checks, eyewitness accounts, and handwriting analyses were pursued, the results were mostly inconclusive. A partial fingerprint possibly left by the Zodiac on Paul Stein's taxi was never definitively matched to any known suspect. One suspect who emerged more prominently than others was Arthur Lee Allen, a Vallejo resident with a checkered past and a curious fascination for cryptography and firearms. Investigators discovered that he owned a Zodiac brand wristwatch and was reported to have made ominous statements about killing or hunting humans. Several circumstantial details pointed suspiciously in Allen's direction. He was allegedly near one of the crime scenes at a relevant time, and certain acquaintances described him as having a bizarre obsession with young couples parked in lovers' lanes. Yet, after repeated interrogations, searches of his home, and analysis of handwriting samples, authorities never managed to tie Allen conclusively to the Zodiac letters or murders. Although he remained a top suspect in the public imagination, and many remained convinced of his guilt, the evidence was never strong enough to bring an indictment. Over the years, numerous other suspects were floated, each with their own peculiar links to the case, handwriting similarities, possible motivations, odd behaviors, but no one was definitively charged or tried. The absence of modern DNA technology meant that even if a partial genetic profile might eventually be extracted from old envelopes, police had no surefire way to confirm a match. By the time advanced DNA profiling had become widespread, many key pieces of evidence had deteriorated or were compromised, and prime suspects like Allen had passed away. Meanwhile, the ciphers themselves continued to fascinate both investigators and the public. The 408 cipher had been solved fairly quickly, revealing a chilling manifesto of sorts. But another coded message, often referred to as the 340 cipher, remained unsolved for over 50 years. Many attempted to crack it. Code breakers, professional cryptographers, hobbyists, even supercomputers. It wasn't until late 2020 that a team of enthusiasts successfully deciphered it, only to find more twisted bragging from the Zodiac, proclaiming his joy in killing and mocking the people who wanted to unmask him. Crucially, it did not reveal his name. Another cipher, the so-called Z13, remains unresolved. The possibility lingers that the Zodiac might have lied about which cipher contained his identity, meaning codebreakers could be searching for a final piece of the puzzle that simply does not exist. Nonetheless, the ciphers have become an integral part of the Zodiac legend, underscoring the idea that he wanted not just to kill, but also to confound and display his intelligence in perverse ways. Although it might seem that the Zodiac's activities slowed down after 1969 and 1970, a series of additional letters trickled in over the early 1970s. Some authorities believe the killer eventually either died, was imprisoned for an unrelated crime, or simply decided to stop murdering. Others suggest that he may have continued killing, but stopped writing letters. The official count typically credits him with 5 known murders and 2 attempted murders. Those are the so-called canonical victims. But some researchers point to other homicides in the Bay Area and beyond that bear faint hallmarks of Zodiac's approach, fueling speculation that his actual body count might be higher. There is also a possibility that earlier murders, such as the 1966 killing of Sherry Jo Bates in Riverside, California, were the Zodiac's handiwork. In that case, a letter was sent anonymously to the local police, referencing details of the crime in a taunting manner reminiscent of the Zodiac style. However, Riverside police have never definitively tied that killing to him, leaving yet another question mark in a saga that already brims with uncertainty. As the years turn into decades, the Zodiac story remained potent in American culture. Journalism, always enthralled by the possibility of closure, continued to follow leads. Authors published books, offering new theories. Some claim certain men in their lives were the Zodiac, pointing to diaries or letters found in attics, suggesting hidden pasts. Conspiracy theories flourished on the internet, including suggestions that the Zodiac might have been connected to the Manson family, or that he had moved to another state to kill under a different pseudonym. Investigators, both official and amateur, poured countless hours into chasing down every shred of evidence. Dave Toschi, the dedicated detective who became somewhat of a celebrity figure, eventually retired from the SFPD. He later expressed regret that he had never solved the Zodiac puzzle. Arthur Lee Allen died without the matter being resolved. Suspicions lingered. The potential for new suspects never fully waned, and even in the 21st century, headlines occasionally pop up with sensational claims like Zodiac Killer identified or new DNA evidence may solve the Zodiac case, only for the revelations to fizzle under scrutiny. Among the reasons the Zodiac endured so powerfully in the public imagination is the sense that he was an invisible puppet master, controlling the media discourse around him, weaponizing the fear of entire communities, and flaunting a self-proclaimed superiority. In his letters, he often depicted himself as a cunning huntsman, referencing how easy it was to pick off unsuspecting lovers in parked cars or threaten school buses full of children. At times, he even toyed with the idea of using bombs. The Bay Area found itself in a state of paranoia that lingered for much of 1969 and 1970. Parents changed their children's commute habits. Couples hesitated before pulling over on quiet roads, and local law enforcement agencies were inundated with calls from frightened citizens who spotted suspicious strangers. Because the Zodiac so clearly craved attention, the newspapers became unwitting participants in his game. They had to balance the responsibility of informing the public with the risk of giving the killer a direct line to stoke further fear. Some editors decided to publish his letters in full, partly out of compliance with his threats and partly because they knew readers craved every detail. Others worried that printing his words gave him exactly what he wanted, the spotlight. As time marched forward, the legend only grew. Hollywood took notice, producing films that dramatized the Zodiac story spinning possibilities about who he might have been, hinting at the tension between a maniac and the dedicated detective in pursuit. True crime aficionados turn the case into a near obsession, analyzing each letter for hidden clues, reconstructing timelines, comparing suspects, and speculating about new breakthroughs. Decades later, the conversation still continues. The possibility of obtaining fresh DNA from envelopes that the Zodiac licked remains an enticing prospect. Indeed, advanced genealogical methods have solved older cold cases in recent years. But whether that final piece of evidence exists in a viable form is uncertain. Some evidence was mishandled or lost, and the passage of time hasn't helped. Even if a partial DNA profile emerges, it would require matching with someone in genealogical databases. No guarantee, especially if the Zodiac never had close relatives who participated in DNA testing, or contamination destroyed the sample's integrity. The ultimate question, of course, is why the Zodiac was never caught. Many factors contributed to his elusiveness. The geographical spread of his murders, the differences in law enforcement jurisdictions, the chaos of the time, and his unpredictability in switching from shooting couples at night to wearing a bizarre hooded costume and stabbing victims during daytime. He might have been older or more cunning than typical criminals. Or perhaps he was simply lucky, striking at random while leaving minimal forensic traces. The ballistic clues were limited. Handwriting analysis suggested the letters came from the same person, but not one suspect's penmanship matched definitively. The ciphers teased at a solution but never revealed his name, and the partial clues gleaned from payphone calls or fleeting eyewitness glimpses weren't enough to pin him down. Then the letters stopped, at least for the most part, and the Zodiac Killer receded into the shadows of unsolved cases. Still, the legacy lives on. He left behind an archetype, the grandiose, attention-seeking predator who manipulates the media and public consciousness to his advantage. He reveled in the sense of power that came from mailing cryptic threats, demanding front-page publication, and watching the entire region quake in fear. Although many notorious serial killers have captured headlines, from Ted Bundy to John Wayne Gacy, the Zodiac remains unique for the sheer interplay between violence and cryptography, for the letter-writing campaign that turned a murder into a twisted myth, and for the fact that after more than 50 years, no authoritative solution has arrived to quell the uncertainty. In the vacuum left by official failure, countless amateur sleuths have turned the Zodiac mystery into a lifetime passion, posting on message boards, forming online communities, analyzing every scrap of evidence. They debate minutiae such as the significance of the cross-circle symbol, the syntax used in the letters, the type of misspellings or references to pop culture. They examine suspects' timelines, attempt advanced cryptanalysis, or comb through old records for new revelations. Perhaps the fundamental appeal is that the Zodiac case combines intellectual challenge, the ciphers and the puzzle aspect, with chilling horror. It is not simply a puzzle for puzzle's sake. It is a puzzle that costs real human lives, a puzzle that stands at the intersection of obsession, tragedy, and a near-cinematic brand of evil. For the families of the victims, Betty Lou Jensen, David Faraday, Darlene Farron, Cecilia Shepard, Paul Stein, and possibly others, the lack of closure remains heartbreaking. While some official statements suggest that the Zodiac may have died or become inactive by the mid-1970s, that does not lessen the anguish of not knowing precisely who was responsible. The possibility that he lived out his days in anonymity, perhaps reading every news article about himself, or even passing by on the street unnoticed, only intensifies the cruelty of his crimes. Decades of investigations, suspect interrogations, media coverage, and code-breaking efforts have not eased that burden fully. Even at present, every so often, some new individual comes forward, claiming they have solved the codes or identified the Zodiac's real name. Usually, these claims crumble under scrutiny. Occasionally, Cryptographic breakthroughs or genealogical testing generate cautious optimism, but the definitive answer always remains just out of reach. In a sense, the Zodiac case is a reflection of the human desire to impose logic on the inexplicable. We want to believe that every killer is caught, that justice ultimately prevails, that ciphers can be solved and confessions extracted. The Zodiac stands as an unsettling refutation of that belief. He is the killer who bragged about his acts, who threatened more bloodshed, and who simply melted away, leaving only fragments of evidence and a legend that refuses to vanish. And so, we remain transfixed. The name Zodiac conjures images of coded letters adorned with strange symbols, hooded figures approaching unsuspecting victims, phone calls from payphones in the dead of night, and a murderer who seemed to relish the game as much as the violence. We see in him the ultimate boogeyman of modern crime, a cunning mind that exploited the news cycles, twisting them to his advantage, enthralling the public even as he horrifyingly destroyed lives. A half-century has passed, yet talk of the Zodiac remains front and center whenever unsolved murders are discussed. Perhaps that is the final testament to his dark brilliance. By manipulating the press, referencing cultural touchstones, and leaving behind elaborate messages, he forced himself into a permanent corner of American consciousness. If a day ever comes when a fresh piece of evidence emerges, some undiscovered DNA trace on an envelope, an incontrovertible match to a suspect, or a deathbed confession from an accomplice, people worldwide will stop what they are doing to listen. But until that day, the Zodiac Killer retains his crown as the most infamous phantom in American criminal lore, a malignant presence who wrote letters in a mocking tone, threatened entire cities, inflicted unimaginable suffering, and walked away, fading into history yet never truly gone.